Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our continuing Facebook Live series that has important topics and notable speakers. Tonight, we have a very important topic, reapportionment, which I know everybody in the political world is interested in, but everyone in the state should be interested in. And we have an expert person to discuss it with us, John Faso. Now, John is a former member of Congress. He was the minority leader of the state assembly for 4 years and served in the state assembly for 16 years. During that period, he was in the assembly for several cycles. He was the lead person on how the assembly Republicans addressed reapportionment. And as such, I think it could be concluded that John is an expert on the topic. John also was the conservative and Republican candidates for governor and state controller. And I've known John for really a long, long time. And I must say to you, we're very fortunate to have an individual of this experience and knowledge to discuss this topic with us. As you know, you can type in questions, and I will see those questions, and I will read them as they are appropriate because we have a limited amount of time. With that, I'd like to turn it over to John.
Well, Chairman Kassar, great to be with you and your audience tonight. It's really a pleasure to be with you. I really salute you for your leadership with the Conservative Party. As Jerry mentioned, he and I have been friends and colleagues and co-workers. Actually, I was his boss for a time when I was minority leader in the Assembly, but for many years. And there's no one in the state who is more devoted to conservative principles and more devoted to the principles that all of us share than Jerry Kassar. So I'm really glad to be with Jerry tonight and happy to be with all of you. Now, Jerry mentioned reapportionment. And, you know, I was reminded, I was down in Baltimore last weekend or last week, and I was going out to dinner with some folks, and we were deluged with cicadas. They were flying all over the place, and they were wiggling on the ground, and they were buzzing around us, and the noise was enormous. We haven't had this yet upstate. I'm not sure we're going to get it, but down in the Maryland, Washington, D.C., Virginia area, and South, they are just omnipresent. The cicadas come out once every 17 years. Well, reapportionment comes out once every 10 years. And this is a topic that, as I tell people, 99% of the people who follow politics are interested in, and probably 0.1% of the regular people in our state and across the country pay attention to this. But yet reapportionment and redistricting is one of the critical factors in determining how our representatives are selected, because the way you draw those lines will often influence and determine who actually represents us, both in the state legislatures across the country and in Congress. So once every 10 years, like the cicadas, the reapportionment gurus come out, the line drawers come out, the term gerrymandering comes out, and we will attempt in this 45 minutes we have here tonight to shed some light on the process and also give you an opportunity as a citizen and as someone who follows politics, give you an opportunity to participate, because unlike the prior 2 centuries of redistricting in New York State, there's something new this time. And the something new is the Independent Redistricting Commission that was adopted in 2014 by the voters of our state as a constitutional amendment, inspired, in fact, by former Mayor Ed Koch, who was, even though he was a Democrat and I was Republican, we turned out to be pretty good friends. And we had many an evening when we were waiting in the green room to go on a local TV show talking about political issues and life and things like that. And so Ed Koch was really the inspiration for this constitutional amendment. And it took a bipartisan effort in the legislature. Governor Cuomo signed legislation about this, and the people adopted a constitutional amendment. So this doesn't have to be a Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal kind of thing. It probably will wind up that way, but it doesn't have to be. And we now, with this independent commission, have the opportunity to affect the process and influence the process. And what I'm going to do now is lead you through a very short slide presentation, which will present to you, and we can move with the first slide. We can talk about fair lines in New York State and redistricting. And so once every 10 years, as I mentioned, all 435 seats in the House of Representatives will get redrawn based upon population shifts in the state. And every state legislature is responsible for ultimately enacting a law which creates redistricting. The new thing here is that we have an independent commission, and I think there are 15 or 16 states that have independent commissions. So as we go through, next slide, we will discuss how this works. So because of shifts within the country, some states will gain representation in the House of Representatives, other states will lose. California and New York actually will lose a seat in this redistricting. First time ever California is losing a seat ever in their history as a state. They now have 53 states. They're going to 53 members of Congress. They're going to go down to 52. Texas is going to gain 2 seats, as will Florida. New York will lose 1 seat. So we'll go from 27 down to 26 seats. And it's like a little bit of musical chairs. Next slide. John, next slide. Okay, the census, the population count of our number of citizens in the state, that will what will determine how the numbers will play out across the country. So COVID has unfortunately delayed the release of these census numbers. We didn't normally would find out on January 1 what the apportionment for every state will be. We only found that out in April of this year. And the census data that will be used to actually carve the districts, the population numbers will only be delivered to the states probably by mid to late July is when we're expecting that data. Normally those data would come to us in April, but they're only going to come to the Independent Commission and to the states in July. Next slide. As I mentioned, in 2014, the voters adopted a constitutional amendment creating a bipartisan independent redistricting commission to draw these lines. The commission is made up of 10 members. There are 4 Democrats appointed by the legislative leaders, 2 this majority leader and speaker of the House of the Senate and Assembly will have appointed 2 members. The minority leaders of the Senate and Assembly will appoint 2 members each. And then those 8 members collectively appoint 2 independent members who are not either Democrats or Republicans. That's all been done. Previously, the legislature drew the lines through a partisan process with a task force on redistricting, but this time it is going to be done by this independent commission. And the independent commission has operated independently. They have actually now hired or will be hiring a independent line drawing consultant who will work for both sides in this redistricting process. Next slide. So the independent commission initially wasn't getting funded, and with some pressure applied to the state legislature, that was remedied. There's a $4 million funding item in the state legislative budget that will support the activities of the independent commission. And that really is a New York, up until the end of March, was the only state in the nation without having funding for its independent commission. But that was remedied by the pressure that was applied, and the independent commission did receive sufficient funding. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, the independent commission is made up of 10 members. They have strict timelines that are contained within the constitutional amendment that the voters approved in 2014. And those strict timelines say they have to release the initial maps for the state assembly, the state senate, and for the 26 new congressional districts in New York State. Those maps have to be released by September 15th. The commission is supposed to conduct 12 public hearings. I'm not sure at this stage whether those hearings will actually be live in person or whether they will be virtual hearings. It may be a combination of both. The commission is just now getting itself set up. They don't, as far as I know, even have their website open, but that's about to be released. So that kind of information will shortly be available. And I'm sure Jerry Kassar and the Conservative Party will be very happy to inform all of you through Facebook and emails, etc., as to the location of that web address and how you can participate in the process and when these public hearings will be held. The maps will be submitted to the state legislature by no later than January 1. Now, the interesting thing, besides the fact that we have this independent commission, which is the first time ever in New York, also for the first time ever, we actually have standards that are contained within our Constitution, which are supposed to guide the drawing of these legislative and congressional districts. They have to protect minority voting rights. The districts have to be as close as possible in equal population, particularly congressional districts. There can't be any variation in population size for a congressional district. You might see a district, every congressional district will be about 775,000 people, and they can only vary by one person in that, from that number. So you'll see some odd line drawing to accommodate that very strict population deviation. The districts have to be compact, contiguous, competitive. They can't be drawn to favor one party or another, or one incumbent over another. They have to respect municipal boundaries, and this is really important as you get outside of the city of New York, for instance, but also within the city of New York, respecting the borough boundaries as well is something that will be important. And of course, some districts will have to, by population reasons, have to cross county lines or town lines, for instance, if you're upstate. But these standards that you see set forth there, it's the first time we've ever had these standards. And there's one other piece that was enacted as a separate piece of legislation that Governor Cuomo and some of the outside good government groups insisted upon, and that's a standard called the Iowa Rule, which comes naturally from the state of Iowa. The Iowa Rule says that if the legislature rejects the plan that's submitted by the independent commission, it is limited in how much it can change those lines that the independent commission has drawn by no more than 2% of the population of any district within a plan for the state assembly or the state senate or for Congress. It cannot vary what the independent commission did. It cannot totally throw out what the independent commission proposed and come up with its own plan. It must adhere to this Iowa rule, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out as we go forward. Next slide. The timeline. Again, I mentioned that the Census Bureau gave us the apportionment. We're going to lose a seat in April. They gave us those numbers in April. They're going to begin this month. They've already begun getting set up. I don't know if they're going to make the first hearing this month in June, but certainly by July, you'll start seeing hearings. August, they say August. I'm hopeful. I've heard that it could be by sometime in mid to late July that we will actually have the data. August at the latest from the Census Bureau. Those are the data, the census blocks and census tract data that will be integral to the line drawers creating the districts. That will come no later than August. The first plans have to be released by September 15th from the Independent Commission. Then in fall of 21, the Independent Commission has to hold those hearings. And again, by the end of the year, they've got to submit a plan to the state legislature. Next slide. the new constitutional amendment. Now, this is something, frankly, there's a little bit of a diabolical action going on, and this is going to be presented to the voters this November. What happened is that the Democrats who control the state legislature passed a new constitutional amendment, which is, I've read it a number of times. It has only one purpose. The only purpose that this constitutional amendment has is to eliminate the meaningful role of the minority party, meaning Republicans, in the operation of the independent commission. And I think it's something that every voter in New York State, regardless of you're on the left or the right, every editorial writer, outside groups like the Brennan Center, which is certainly is a very left-oriented organization, and outside groups and political parties like the Conservative Party, everyone should be outraged at this proposed constitutional amendment. It is a very vaguely worded statute. It'll be virtually impossible for most citizens to make heads or tails of it. But the bottom line is that this amendment is intended to override some of the protections for the minority party, which were built into the 2014 constitutional amendment. It's an extremely cynical and really anti-democratic, small d, effort on the part of the legislative Democrats to really change what was really a good government approach that Ed Koch organized and led that effort to get that amendment passed. I actually wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal back in February saying Ed Koch has to be rolling over in his grave, God bless his soul, seeing what is being proposed to the voters this year. How they market this, I don't know. They'll try to say it's a reform. It is not a reform. So everyone should be on the lookout for this. And I know that good government groups, editorial writers, and certainly Conservative Party and Republican Party, and I think any common sense Democrat will look at this and say, this is a scam. It's something that they're trying to put one over on the voters. It is not a reform. It is actually the reverse of a reform. So everyone should keep in mind there's a new constitutional amendment that's coming down the pike that'll be on the ballot this November. Next slide. Now, here are the existing congressional districts in New York State. These lines were drawn by a federal court master. They were not drawn from a partisan standpoint. They were drawn by a federal court master who really acted in a nonpartisan way that created these districts. But every one of these districts was targeted at about 717,000 people because we're losing a district. Every new district in New York State, the 26 rather than 27, will have to be about 775,000 people. So every district is every member of Congress going to have to gain population to represent. Next slide. Now, obviously, both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, pay attention to redistricting. As I mentioned at the outset, the Democrats have something called the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which was founded by President Obama and his former Attorney General Eric Holder. And they have stockpiled a lot of dough to try to advance Democratic redistricting efforts in the states. That's something that's certainly their right to do, but it's interesting how they only litigate on redistricting in states that are Republican controlled. They don't litigate in states. If you want to see the most egregious gerrymander in the entire country, look at the Maryland congressional districts, the one represented by Congressman John Faso. You will be amazed and astonished at that congressional district. Next slide. And we've already seen some efforts that Democrats have made. They would reduce the number of Republican-held seats in New York State from 8 to 3 by a very partisan redistricting. And if you look at these were maps that came out of Washington D.C. by Democratic interests, and the intent here is to push every possible Republican into only 3 districts within the state and make the rest of the districts ones that would be very difficult to have a competitive advantage or competitive district for the voters to choose. And remember, this flies in the face of our constitutional amendment, which says that the district shall not be drawn for partisan advantage, and that we should try to have districts that are competitive and that represent communities of interest. These districts that are being submitted or suggested by partisan line drawers out of Washington certainly don't meet that test. What's the next slide, please? Here's another example. This one was published by a noted political writer, Dave Wasserman. And again, this districting scheme would attempt to reduce the number of Republican districts in New York from 8 to 3. And it's just another variation on the theme. You see, for instance, the 25th district in pink in the top left corner of New York would basically pull in areas from Buffalo, run through Niagara County, and then have basically a short string along Lake Ontario, and then go into Rochester. That's intended to create a Democratic seat between Buffalo and Rochester. And again, that districting scheme doesn't reflect and doesn't respect the communities of interest. Right now, the district that the federal court drew in 2012 that affected Rochester and Monroe County, the entire county is one district, and then simply one town in Ontario County is added in order to meet the population requirements. This would obviously completely blow up that type of scheme and that kind of approach. So it's not a reasonable thing to expect, but this is what we can expect. The partisans on both sides will try to advance their interests. The fact of the matter, this flies in the face of the constitutional amendment that the people of New York adopted in 2012. And I don't think this would fly in front of a court, either state or federal. Next slide. And so what can we do? We have a quote up there that Malcolm Smith, who was the Democratic majority leader of the Senate back in 2010, he said, the Democrats, quote, are going to draw lines so that Republicans will be in oblivion in the state of New York for the next 20 years. He could have said Republicans and conservatives, but that's really what their intention is. So what can we do? We need people to participate in the public hearing process to basically advance the notion of why should your community be in a certain district? Why should the communities of interest that are represented in that particular region, why are their economic and social connections important to represent in a particular district? Those are the important important questions that the independent commission by our Constitution has to consider. And it's important for people that are on the right, on the conservative side of this equation to participate. Back in 2011 and 2012, very liberal groups overwhelmed the California Independent Commission with testimony saying why their viewpoint should prevail. And it really is important for both sides in this process to put their oar in the water and to participate in redistricting. So I urge you to pay attention to the timeline, which will be announced shortly. Jerry and the Conservative Party will put out the information as to the web address of the Independent Commission. And everyone who's on this webcam tonight, on this Facebook Live presentation, courtesy of the Conservative Party, I hope that you will do so and that you will stay involved and participate in this process. So I think that's the end of the slide presentation. We're at 7:25. I think I got through that pretty quickly without too much verbosity. And Chairman Kassar, I know that you may have some questions from people, and I'd be happy to try to respond to them at this point.
Well, I'd like to. I have some questions I want to start. Questions are popping up, but I want to also start. So, John, there's been some talk that there was a miscount. I wouldn't call it corrupted, but that the count in the state is actually somewhat higher, and that we wouldn't have lost any congressional seats. Can you speak to that? And is it possible that the numbers could actually get adjusted?
I doubt it. The census, challenging the census approach or the census methodology has historically been very difficult. There have been a couple of lawsuits that have been brought this year. I don't believe that they've gotten very far. It was said that New York lost that 27th seat in Congress by an undercount of about 89 voters. It really seems almost absurd that it could be that close, but sometimes this happens, and there are, our loss of the seat was Minnesota's gain. Minnesota kept its, I believe, 8 congressional districts, and the way the population apportionment works, the 435 seats are divided among the states in a very complicated, complex formula, which I won't even try to get into tonight because I would mangle it. But the last seat in the country was down to 89 people in New York State. If we had 90 people more in the census, we would have kept our 27th seat, according to the census. Now, there have been questions about the methodology, and there have been a lot of issues because of COVID, whether the census was truly accurate or not. I'm just skeptical that any of the proposed litigation or the litigation that's out there will actually change this at the end of the day. So mark me down as skeptical on that one.
So speaking of the courts, in the past 10 years, regardless of our state constitutional amendment and regardless of other statutes, in the last 10 years, there's been quite a bit of jurisprudence in the federal level, some in the state, that's even in some cases made its way up to the Supreme Court. How will these decisions impact New York State? Are there different standards for the state legislature versus Congress?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point you raised, Jerry. The major standard that's different for the state legislatures versus Congress has to do with the population deviation. And the federal courts through the years have said every congressional district within a state has to have the exact number of people in it. And if you don't have the exact number of people in each of the districts in the state, you run the risk of having your plan thrown out to the advantage of a plan that's submitted that has a closer deviation. So literally every single district that is drawn that'll come out of this independent process, every single district will have either no deviation, or there'll be one person above the deviation or one person below the deviation. That's it. For the state legislature, however, it is different. The federal courts through the years have allowed a deviation on the population of assembly and senate districts in the state legislatures to be the number is 10%. So in essence, if, for instance, an assembly district in New York State should be 130,000 people, hypothetically, I'm not sure what the number will be this coming redistricting, but approximately 130,000 people. That means that you could have a district in the assembly map that is 5% below the 130,000 people in population or 5% above. So a total deviation between the lowest populated district in the assembly and the highest populated district in the assembly of 10%. So 5% below, 5% above, and that's one of the allowable distinctions or deviations that the courts have permitted. Now, with the new standards in our Constitution, I think anyone drawing lines in New York for the legislature, Senate, and Assembly would be advised to have those lines as close as possible and to avoid that 10% top to bottom deviation and make the deviation a much narrower number. I think that would be a more defensible position to be in if you were in court defending your plan. So it's also important to keep in mind that it's not that difficult to get your deviations closer. Sometime in the past, you've seen deviations be large deviations depending on the political advantage that one side or the other sought to achieve in this process. I think having those deviations much closer, not being exact like the federal requirement for Congress, which I think is in many ways illogical, but having a deviation that is closer than that 10%. If you had deviations that were more in the range of 5%, meaning 2.5% below, 2.5% above, I think that might be more defensible, particularly under our new constitutional requirement.
I remember someone telling me that when you did the reapportionment or years back, you actually submitted a set of maps like that, but the jurisprudence didn't really exist at that point for you to create a fair and independent reapportionment, you might say.
Right.
So I mean, I know you know that inside out, and that makes a lot of sense. I do have some questions that came up. I mean, this is kind of a generalized question, but the person is asking, what in your view would come out of the legislature, even with an independent commission? Are we likely to have a Democratic gain, a GOP gain, retain where we are? Your general thoughts about what would likely happen, all things being equal, before anyone goes to court?
Well, I think that a fair process would not necessarily favor one side or the other. And if you strictly adhered to the constitutional amendment that the people adopted in 2014, it doesn't favor one side or the other. The practical reality is that Democrats have a significant enrollment advantage in New York State. They have a significant political advantage from that standpoint. And then you have places like in the city of New York where there are areas of the city that are basically one party rule, and Republicans, conservatives don't offer any meaningful alternative. So that's not going to change through this process. I do think, though, that if you have a plan, both for the Senate and Assembly, that adhere to the constitutional requirements and that respect jurisdictional boundaries and communities of interest while protecting the rights of language and ethnic minorities, I think that that's the kind of arrangement that would create a more even playing field that would be to the advantage of our side. Because I think that right now our numbers in both the Assembly and Senate are, even though the Senate they only have 20 Republican senators right now on lines that were drawn by Republicans. I think that actually, depending on what the overall political environment is, it could be a fair line process, could be to the advantage politically of Republicans and conservatives, both in the Assembly and Senate. But I think, let's face it, a lot of this depends upon what's happening, what's the overall political environment that you're running in. I've run in elections where the wind is at your back, and I've run in elections where the wind is in your face. And it's much better to run when the wind is at your back, because a lot of people aren't necessarily coming out to vote in state legislature. They might be coming out to vote for Congress or the U.S. Senate or president. And we all know presidential election years will generate a lot more turnout than an off year. So the bottom line is that a fair process, I'm not sure will necessarily advantage one side or the other. I think it would be create more fair fight districts around the state, and I think that would be in the public interest, actually.
So I think the audience should know there is a registered conservative on the independent commission, the way it was structured, and you've given a lot of credit to Ed Koch, which is certainly accurate, but I think the audience should also know that some of the biggest supporters of this were Republican senators who were in the majority at the time, but felt that we could not continue to go through this this process the way it had been going for so many years. So, it's GOP and conservative parties probably deserve, a fair amount of credit for taking this forward. And now the Democrats are trying to knock it down. But let me ask you this. So let's just say that amendment passes. Person is asking here, does that result in more maps coming forward to choose from? John, what does that actually, how does that set us back if the amendment passes?
Well, I mean, I think that's still up in the air. What's very damaging about the amendment is that it basically eliminates the organizational Republican role in the commission. Right now, there are co-executive directors of the commission. It's balanced between Democrat and Republican. They would take that away. So you would have a solely Democratic party-run commission, and you would not have the kind of equal representation of both sides. And I think that goes against what the public would generally want to see. You know, it's ironic. The Democrats are pushing a plan in Washington, H.R. 1. They call it For the People Act, which is a massive federal intervention and control over state and local election laws. And I think it's very misguided. But one of the provisions in that legislation is a provision that says that there shall be in each of the states an independent redistricting commission created. And so while the Democrats in Washington are promoting H.R. 1, which has a lot of bad provisions, but also this provision about independent redistricting, the Democrats in New York State are trying to eviscerate the independent commission that Ed Koch and others were the primary movers behind that independent commission back in 2014. So it really is very hypocritical. And again, we don't know where that constitutional amendment will appear on the ballot. The Board of Elections has got to write an analysis of that amendment and put it on the ballot for people. But it is a snake in the grass. It is something we should all be against, and has no meaningful purpose other than to advance a partisan interest, which goes contrary to what the independent commission was supposed to be.
So many people on this call, on this Facebook Live, including party leaders, are also members of taxpayer associations, chambers, civics, or other types of fraternal organizations. They should understand that when these hearings come up, as much as it's important for a political party to speak up, which we will, they should be encouraging these groups to also speak up for what is good or bad or against what's bad for their own communities, because that has to be, I shouldn't say that has to be listened to, but that has heavy credibility, particularly if any of this stuff starts to move into the court system. People need to understand that their role here is not strictly the political party route. Without question, we'll be playing that, but they need to do that too. John, I think there's something else the public needs to know. There are 4 legislative conferences and an independent commission, all either directly or indirectly are receiving taxpayer funding. There is a legislative task force in demographics and reapportionment that never goes away, and that is also receiving taxpayer funding. There are literally millions upon millions on millions of dollars being spent. Yeah. And basically, it's kind of like one of those dirty little secrets that the people are kept in the dark from by the legislature, which is also kind of the secret with public financing, how much money gets spent. But can you address that, the waste of taxpayers' money on overlays here, which are probably mostly about hiring people?
Well, once the people adopted the independent commission approach in 2014, the legislature should have abolished the legislative commission on demographic research and reapportionment, is what it's the official name. And but for some reason they've kept it. They've literally had nothing to do for the last 9 years, and now they are potentially springing back into life, even though we have an independent commission, which has now been funded. So it's completely redundant. It should not be there. I think the legislative task force, I think their budget is in the $3 to $4 million range per year since 2012, and there's no meaningful purpose for it. So it should be abolished.
So an individual's asking if you could further define the concept of communities of interest and the role it plays. What is a community of interest, essentially?
Well, it could relate to two counties next to each other. Do they share a community college? Do they have commuting patterns that interact with each other? Are they surrounding a larger? Are they part of a larger metropolitan area in the state? In the Albany area, we have the Capital District. So you could readily say that the communities of Albany County, Rensselaer County, Saratoga County, and Schenectady County, they're commonly referred to as the Capital Region. Central New York, the same thing. So the North Country, Southern Tier. Are there locations within those communities that are there are common economic, social interactions? So, for instance, Nassau and Suffolk. Nassau and Suffolk right now have approximately 4.3, 4.4 congressional districts. Under the new lines, they probably should only have 4 complete congressional districts. So should those be 2 districts within Suffolk County and 2 districts within Nassau County? Or should those districts cross county lines in some fashion? So I think those are the issues. Is the representation that people are going to receive from a state legislator, a state senator or assembly person, or a member of Congress, is that representation going to be more logical, easier for those representatives to interact with their constituents? Or is it like the old Claudia Tenney Assembly District? Is it going to stretch for 140 miles across 7 counties that have no tangible connection to one another? It's just pieces of geography strung together. That's the kind of thing that we need to avoid in this process. And Jerry Nadler's congressional district inexplicably goes from Manhattan and then snakes through and picks up communities in southern Brooklyn. There's no reason why that district should go out of Manhattan. That district should be entirely within the borough of Manhattan. So there are a lot of things that could be done to make these districts more logical, make it easier for the representatives to represent, but also make it easier for the constituents to interact with their elected officials. That's how I would classify as communities of interest.
So I'm going to ask one last question and then we'll wrap up. And I think this is the easiest question of the night. What are the odds we agree on new lines without litigation?
I think those odds are very low because we are a litigious society, and there's a whole cottage industry of redistricting lawyers that, like the locusts, they come out every 10 years, and inevitably someone is not going to like whatever the product is. But I think, in New York, we actually, because we have a definable set of standards in our Constitution, and because we have the Iowa rule, it limits what the games the legislature can play. But we know they're playing a game right now with this new constitutional amendment. But I think the standards that are in the Constitution create some safeguards that will help us avoid frivolous litigation. Maybe there will be some serious litigation in this process. I hope that we could come to a process without litigation, but the logical part of my brain says that's unlikely.
I thought you were just going to say 0. That's what I thought you were going to say. John, would you like to summarize? We're at the 45-minute point, and if you could summarize and conclude, and I'll say
Jerry, just thank you for your leadership of the Conservative Party. Thank you for hosting this Facebook Live event. I'm pleased to be here. I'm going to do another one for another group called Reclaim New York in another week, actually next Monday. And these are important because getting information out to our citizenry is critical. Those of us on the Republican conservative side aren't as good, I think, about being active in these areas as our friends on the other side. So I think that it's really important for people to mobilize, for them to to have their voices heard in this process. When the commission announces its hearings, it's really going to be important for people to participate. And I'm sure that they'll be able to use your good offices in the Conservative Party as a resource to help them further so that they can best know how to represent their views and get them into this independent commission process. So I really thank everyone for joining us tonight. I thank you, Jerry, and the Conservative Party for giving me the opportunity to participate in this event.
Well, John, I appreciate it. You're obviously an expert, and you're giving us your time, and you've had a long and spectacular career on a number of different issues that have confronted the state. And right now, this is beginning to line up for really more than the political people, for the whole state as the next big issue besides getting rid of Cuomo. So let me just summarize and say this: if individuals have additional questions, they should contact me. We need to have an ongoing dialogue about reapportionment. It's the biggest political thing in town for the next couple of months, years. So there's no need for you to speculate. You can check in with me, and I could talk to John, or I could talk to the individual we have on the commission to try to get you more specific answers about what is happening next and how you can play a role. This has to be an interactive project going forward for the next, I guess, 17 months. So with that, thank you very much, and good evening.